Hello and welcome to the Essential Property Podcast with your hosts, Paul Samuda and Amanda Woodward. With 45 years of combined experience in the world of property buying, selling, investing and developing, they are here to share with you their knowledge in the Stoke-on-Trent, Newcastle-under-Lyme and Crewe property market. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Essential Property Podcast. Today I'm introducing a new style episode with friends that takes a deep dive into the Labour Party's proposal for the Renters' Rights Bill from a tenant perspective and how landlords need to be ready to rise to the challenge and face it head on. I hope you enjoy this episode.
It's the Labour Party's proposed Renters' Rights Bill.
Big changes.
So imagine renting, but without that constant fear of eviction, just because your landlord decides they don't like you anymore.
Yeah, that's the kind of future this bill is trying to create.
Definitely a future a lot of people would like to see.
Absolutely. And we're going right to the source for this one, the Labour Party manifesto itself. No need to rely on someone else's interpretation.
Yeah, cutting through all the noise and spin.
Exactly. We're getting straight to the heart of what these proposals could mean for renters in England.
Because it seems like they're not messing around with this bill.
Yeah.
It's not just like tweaking a few things here and there.
Right. It's going for some pretty fundamental changes to the whole system.
So what's the big why behind all of this? What's the problem they're trying to solve?
Well, the manifesto doesn't mince words. They straight up call the private rental sector in England the least affordable, the poorest quality and the most insecure type of housing out there.
Wow, okay, so they're not sugarcoating it.
Nope, they're laying it all out there.
It's one thing to hear about housing struggles in general, but when you put it like that, least affordable, poorest quality, most insecure, it really hits home.
It does. It paints a pretty bleak picture, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about millions of renters who are dealing with this.
Millions.
Millions, yeah. Facing that constant stress of possibly being forced out of their homes, often with very little notice.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the abstract ideas, but it's important to remember the human impact here.
Absolutely.
This is real people's lives we're talking about.
Right, and that insecurity, it affects every part of your life. I mean, how
Right.
can you really settle in, build a community plan for the future when you're always wondering if you'll have to up and move?
Yeah, it's like living with this constant low-level anxiety.
Exactly. It makes it really hard to put down roots and feel like you belong.
Okay, so let's dive into the specifics of this bill. One of the things I've heard a lot about is getting rid of no-fault evictions under Section 21. What does that actually mean for people?
So picture this. You're renting a place, right? And you have a lease for, say, 6 months or a year.
Okay, a pretty standard setup.
Yeah, exactly. Now, under Section 21, your landlord can decide at the end of that lease that they want you out.
And they don't have to give you a reason.
Exactly. That's the no-fault part. It could be that they want to sell the property or rent it to someone else for more money, or maybe they just don't like the way you arrange your furniture. It doesn't matter.
That's kind of crazy when you think about it. You could be the perfect tenant, paying rent on time, keeping the place clean, not causing any trouble.
And they could still kick you out.
Just like that.
Just like that, with only 2 months' notice.
So this bill would completely scrap that.
It would. It proposes switching to what's called a system of periodic tenancies.
Okay, and what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it means you have an ongoing agreement with your landlord. You can stay in the property as long as you're paying your rent and following the rules of your tenancy agreement.
So no more arbitrary evictions.
Right. Your landlord would need a valid reason to evict you, and they'd have to follow a proper legal process.
So this sounds like a huge win for renters.
It is. It gives them a lot more security and control over their living situation.
But what about landlords? Doesn't this make it almost impossible for them to get their property back if they need to?
That's a concern some landlords have raised, for sure.
Yeah, it seems like it could really tie their hands.
Well, the bill actually addresses that. It sets out specific grounds for eviction. Like if a tenant isn't paying rent or is damaging the property or is engaging in antisocial behavior, those are all still valid reasons to evict.
So it's not like renters can just do whatever they want.
No, definitely not. There are still rules and landlords still have rights, but those rights are balanced against the rights of tenants to have a stable and secure home.
So it's about creating a more level playing field.
Exactly.
Okay, so the bill is addressing security of tenure, and it's making the eviction process more fair and transparent. What else does it cover?
Well, another big one is addressing the power imbalance between landlords and tenants.
In what way?
Well, right now it can feel like landlords hold all the cards. They can pretty much dictate the terms of the tenancy agreement, and tenants often feel like they have no choice but to accept whatever is offered.
Yeah, especially in a tight housing market.
Exactly. So the bill introduces a couple of new things to try to level the playing field. One is a new landlord ombudsman.
Okay, so what is an ombudsman exactly?
Think of it like a neutral third party who can step in and help resolve disputes between tenants and landlords. It's a less formal and less expensive alternative to going to court.
Interesting. So kind of like a mediator.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Someone who can help both sides come to a fair and reasonable solution.
And the other big change you mentioned.
The other big change is the creation of a private rented sector database. This would be a central hub for information about landlords and their properties.
So I could like look up a potential landlord and see their track record.
Exactly. You could see things like whether they've had any complaints filed against them or whether they've been following the rules and regulations.
That's a game changer.
It is. It brings a whole new level of transparency to the rental market.
Like having a Yelp for landlords.
Exactly. You can finally see what you're getting into before you sign that lease.
Wow. Okay, so the bill is tackling unfair evictions. It's introducing more transparency and accountability. What about the actual quality of the places people are renting?
That's a major focus as well. The bill proposes extending the decent home standard to all private rentals.
Okay, remind me what the decent home standard is all about.
It basically sets out a bunch of requirements for safety and livability in rental properties. Things like making sure there's proper heating and ventilation and that the property is free from damp and mold.
So no more leaky roofs and dodgy wiring.
Hopefully not. Landlords would be legally obligated to make sure their properties meet these standards.
And I remember we talked about a Wobb's Law in a previous episode. That would be incorporated into this bill as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that means landlords would have to act quickly to address any serious hazards like mold in their properties. No more dragging their feet and putting tenants' health at risk.
That's a really important addition, especially in light of that tragic case.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this bill is tackling a lot. It's addressing unfair evictions. It's bringing more transparency to the market. It's setting higher standards for rental properties. It's a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah, it's pretty ambitious.
Definitely ambitious.
Yeah.
But are there any other key points we should touch on before we move on?
Well, one more thing that's worth mentioning is the bill's proposal to strengthen the rights of tenants to have pets in their rentals.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one for a lot of people.
It is. Right now, landlords can often just say no to pets without giving a reason.
Yeah, and that forces a lot of people to choose between their furry friends and having a place to live.
Exactly. This bill would make it much harder for landlords to just say no to pets outright.
So that's good news for all the animal lovers out there.
It is. But it's important to note that landlords could still require tenants to have pet insurance.
That makes sense. It protects them from any potential damage.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between the rights of tenants and the rights of landlords.
Right. So no more blanket bans on pets, but landlords can still set some reasonable conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. This bill seems like it could really shake things up in the rental market.
It definitely could.
And while there are a lot of potential benefits for tenants, we also need to consider the perspective of landlords and how these changes might affect them.
That's a really important point. We need to look at all sides of the issue.
So that's exactly what we'll do after a quick break. We'll be back to discuss the potential challenges and opportunities this bill presents for landlords.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into some of the key changes in this renters' rights bill and how they might actually work in practice.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about ending Section 21 evictions and moving to these periodic tenancies. Can you break down what that actually looks like for both tenants and landlords?
Sure. So imagine you're renting a place now and you have a fixed-term lease, for 6 months or a year.
A pretty typical setup.
Exactly. And even if things aren't great, maybe the place isn't quite what you expected or your circumstances change, you're kind of stuck there until the lease runs out.
Yeah, that's just how fixed-term leases work.
Right. And that's where Section 21 comes in. It basically allows the landlord to end the tenancy at the end of that fixed term without having to give you a specific reason.
So even if you've been a model tenant, paying your rent on time, keeping the place clean, being a good neighbor.
Doesn't matter. Under Section 21, they can still give you notice and you have to move out.
It seems kind of unfair, like the power is all in the landlord's hands.
Yeah, a lot of renters feel that way.
Yeah.
And that's why this move towards periodic tenancies is such a big deal.
Okay, so how would things work under this new system?
Well, with a periodic tenancy, it's more like an ongoing agreement with your landlord.
Okay.
You can stay in the property for as long as you like, as long as you're paying rent and keeping to the terms of the tenancy agreement.
So no more fear of being kicked out for no reason.
Exactly. And if you want to move out, you just give the required notice, usually a couple of months, and that's it.
So much more flexibility and control for renters.
Right. It creates a lot more stability.
But I can see why some landlords might be a bit hesitant about this. They might worry about losing control of their property.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern they've raised. What happens if they have a legitimate reason to evict someone?
Exactly. Like if a tenant is really causing problems.
Well, the bill addresses this directly. It sets out specific grounds for eviction. Things like not paying rent, causing damage to the property, engaging in antisocial behavior, that kind of thing.
So it's not like renters have carte blanche to do whatever they want.
No, not at all. There are still rules and landlords still have rights, but those rights have to be balanced against the rights of tenants to have a secure home.
Right. It's about finding a better balance.
Exactly. And to give you a more concrete example, let's say a landlord wants to sell their property or move back in themselves.
Right.
Under this new system, they'd have to give the tenant a 12-month protected period at the start of the tenancy.
So for a whole year, the tenant is safe from being evicted for those reasons.
Exactly. It gives them time to settle in and not worry about being uprooted right away.
And after that first year?
Even then, the landlord would still have to give 4 months' notice for those specific reasons.
Okay. So that's still a decent amount of time for the tenant to find a new place.
Right. It's not like they'd be out on the street with just a couple of weeks' notice.
It seems like this could really help to prevent people from becoming homeless.
Absolutely. That constant fear of eviction can really take a toll on people and make it harder for them to manage their lives.
Okay, so we've talked about security of tenure. Let's move on to another big issue, rent increases. The bill proposes giving tenants more power to challenge those increases. Can you explain how that would work?
Sure. So under the bill, landlords would still be able to increase rent, but only once a year.
Okay.
And they'd have to follow a specific process, giving tenants at least 2 months' notice.
And what if the tenant thinks the increase is just too high?
Well, then they can take it to the first-tier tribunal.
The what now?
The first-tier tribunal. It's basically a court that specifically deals with housing disputes.
Got it.
So the tribunal would look at things like the average rent for similar properties in the area and decide whether the landlord's proposed increase is reasonable.
So it's not just a case of the tenant saying, I don't want to pay more, and automatically getting their way.
Right. There's an actual process to make sure things are fair.
And the tribunal could actually lower the rent.
Exactly. They could decide that the landlord's proposed increase is too high and set a lower rent instead.
Interesting. So it's not just about preventing increases that are way out of line, but also about making sure rents stay affordable.
Right. It's about protecting tenants from being priced out of their homes.
Now, I've also heard the bill wants to get rid of these things called rent review clauses. What are those and why are they being targeted?
Rent review clauses can be a bit of a minefield, to be honest. They're often written in a way that's really hard for tenants to understand.
So kind of buried in the fine print.
Exactly. And they can give landlords a lot of leeway to increase rent without much justification. They might allow for increases more than once a year or tie the increases to some vague benchmark that's hard to measure.
So it's kind of a way for landlords to sneak in extra rent hikes.
Yeah, essentially. And that's why the bill wants to get rid of them. It's about making the whole process simpler and more transparent for everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. So less legal jargon, more clarity for both tenants and landlords.
Exactly. It's about leveling the playing field and making sure everyone understands the rules of the game.
Now let's talk about the decent home standard. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth digging into a bit more. What will this mean for renters who are tired of living in places that are frankly just not up to par?
This is a big one. The decent home standard has been around for a while, but it's only applied to social housing. Up until now, private renters haven't had the same protection.
So what's changing?
This bill would extend the decent home standard to all private rental properties. So basically, it means every rental property would have to meet certain basic requirements for safety and livability.
So things like working heating and hot water.
Exactly. And proper ventilation, no more damp and moldy walls, no more leaky roofs or drafty windows.
No more having to wear your coat indoors in the middle of winter.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
The point is to make sure that all rental properties are decent places to live no matter who owns them.
And this isn't just about making things nicer. It's about health and safety too.
Right. Damp and mold can cause serious health problems, especially for children and people with respiratory issues.
And remember, Owab's law that we discussed before, that would be incorporated into the private rented sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So landlords would have clear timelines for dealing with serious hazards like mold, no more excuses for putting tenants' health at risk.
It's about making sure that everyone has access to safe and healthy housing, regardless of whether they own or rent.
Right. Housing is a fundamental need, and everyone deserves to live in a place that's fit for purpose.
Okay, so we've covered security of tenure fair, rent increases, decent living conditions. What about the fun stuff, like pets?
Yes, the pet-friendly part of the bill. This is something a lot of people are excited about.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So many people have to give up their pets because they can't find a landlord who will allow them.
It's a heartbreaking situation, and this bill is trying to address that. So, under the proposed changes, tenants would have a much stronger right to request pets in their rentals.
So no more blanket bans on pets.
It wouldn't be quite that straightforward. Landlords could still set some reasonable conditions, like requiring tenants to have pet insurance to cover any potential damage.
Right, that seems fair. It protects both sides, the tenant's right to have a pet and the landlord's right to protect their property.
Exactly. It's about finding a good balance.
Okay, now before we move on, I want to circle back to the private rented sector database and the landlord ombudsman that we talked about earlier. Can you remind us why those are so important?
Sure. The database is all about transparency. It would be a central hub for information about landlords and their properties. So before you even sign a lease, you could look up a potential landlord and see their track record.
So like if they've had a lot of complaints filed against them or if they've been known to ignore repairs.
Exactly. It would give potential tenants a lot more information so they could make an informed decision about where to live.
So it's like having a consumer reports for landlords.
Yeah, it would definitely make the whole process a lot more transparent.
And the landlord ombudsman, what's their role again?
They would act as a neutral third party to help resolve disputes between tenants and landlords. So instead of having to go to court, which can be expensive and time-consuming, tenants and landlords could go to the ombudsman for a quicker and less formal resolution.
So kind of like a mediator.
Exactly. They would try to help both sides come to a fair and reasonable agreement.
That sounds like a really valuable resource.
It is. And it would be free for tenants and landlords to use.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of really important changes here. But there's one more thing I want to touch on before we move on. The single implementation date for all these changes.
Right. So instead of phasing things in gradually, the bill proposes that all these changes would come into effect on the same day.
Why is that such a big deal?
Well, in the past, housing reforms have often been rolled out really slowly, with different rules applying to new and existing tenancies. It created a lot of confusion and uncertainty, and sometimes it meant that some people were left behind.
So this single implementation date is about making a clean break.
Exactly. It would mean that everyone is playing by the same rules from day one.
It's a bold move. It definitely sends a message that they're serious about making these changes happen.
It does.
Okay.
And it could really help to streamline the whole process and make things clearer for everyone.
But wouldn't it be a lot for everyone to adjust to all at once?
It would be a big shift for sure, but the bill has provisions to ensure a smooth transition, like existing rent increases and notices that were served before the implementation date would still be valid.
Okay, so it's not like everything would just be thrown up in the air overnight.
Right. They're trying to strike a balance between making these changes quickly and making sure the process is manageable for everyone.
It sounds like they've really thought this through.
It seems that way.
Okay, so we've really delved into the specifics of this bill, but I think it's important to step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely. Because all of this isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a much larger conversation about housing in England.
And about social equality.
Exactly. The fact that a bill this sweeping is even being proposed tells us a lot about the state of the housing market.
It's clearly not working for a lot of people.
No, it's not. Millions are struggling to afford a decent place to live, facing constant insecurity and feeling like their rights are being ignored.
It's a system that's in desperate need of reform.
I agree. And this bill is a bold attempt to address those fundamental problems.
It's about recognizing that housing isn't just some commodity. It's a basic human right.
Absolutely. Everyone deserves to live in a safe, secure, and affordable home.
And this bill is saying that we need to do better. We need to create a system that works for everyone, not just a privileged few.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful message.
It's definitely an exciting prospect, but we also need to be realistic. There are always unintended consequences when you make big changes like this.
Right. It's important to think about the potential challenges as well as the
Right.
opportunities.
Exactly. So that's what we'll do in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore some of the potential downsides of these changes, and we'll talk about what the future might hold for the rental market in England. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about how this renters' rights bill could be a game changer for tenants in England. But let's flip the script for a bit and look at things from the other side of the coin. What about the landlords?
Yeah, we definitely need to consider their perspective too. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of all these new protections for renters, but we can't forget that landlords play an important role in the housing market too.
Right. It's not about demonizing landlords or pitting them against tenants. It's about finding a system that works for everyone.
Exactly. And while the bill is clearly designed to protect tenants, we need to think about how these changes might affect landlords. And not all of those effects might be what the lawmakers intended.
So what are some of the concerns that landlords might have about this bill?
Well, I think one of the biggest worries is this perceived loss of control over their properties. With Section 21 gone and periodic tenancies becoming the norm, some landlords might feel like it'll be much harder to deal with difficult tenants.
Yeah, I can see that. If you have someone who's constantly late with rent or causing damage or disrupting the neighbors, it could become a lot more complicated to get them out.
Exactly. And even though the bill does lay out specific grounds for eviction, some landlords might worry that the process will be too burdensome or that the courts will be more likely to side with the tenant.
So it's not just about having a valid reason to evict someone, but also about how easy or difficult that process is.
Right. And then there's the financial side of things. With tenants having more security and the power to challenge rent increases, some landlords might worry about keeping up with rising costs. Things like mortgage payments, property maintenance, all of that.
Yeah, and they might worry that they won't be able to increase rents to reflect market value or that they'll be stuck with unexpected expenses to meet those new property standards we talked about.
Exactly. And let's not forget all the extra paperwork and admin that comes with things like the new database and the landlord ombudsman.
Right. That's time and effort that landlords didn't necessarily have to deal with before.
So it's understandable that some landlords might be feeling a bit apprehensive about all these changes. It's a lot to take in.
But it's also worth remembering that the majority of landlords out there are responsible and care about providing decent housing for their tenants.
Absolutely. And for those landlords, these changes could actually be a good thing in the long run.
How so?
Well, think about it. A more stable rental market means fewer vacancies and a more consistent income stream. If tenants feel secure in their homes, they're more likely to stay put, which is good news for landlords.
That makes sense. Less turnover, less time and money spent finding new tenants.
Exactly. And those higher property standards we talked about, that could make their properties more desirable and ultimately increase their value.
Right. So it's not just about expenses, it's also about potential long-term gains.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from short-term gains to long-term sustainability.
And a system that weeds out bad landlords through things like the database could actually make the whole sector more professional and reputable.
Absolutely.
It raises the bar for everyone and creates a more level playing field. So it's not necessarily a doom and gloom scenario for landlords. It's more about adapting to a new landscape and seeing the potential benefits of a fairer and more balanced rental market.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that many landlord associations have actually come out in support of some aspects of this bill, particularly the measures aimed at cracking down on rogue landlords.
That's interesting. So it's not like there's a clear divide between landlords and tenants on this issue.
Right. There's definitely some common ground, and I think that's where the real progress can be made.
It sounds like there's room for collaboration and constructive dialogue as these changes are implemented.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, everyone wants the same thing. A rental market that works well, is fair to both sides, and provides safe and decent homes for people.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener?
Yeah.
If you're renting in England, this bill could have a massive impact on your life. It could mean greater security in your home, the ability to challenge unfair rent increases, and the right to live in a property that meets basic standards of safety and decency.
And if you're a landlord, it's important to stay informed about these proposed changes and how they might affect you. Engage in the conversation, share your perspective, and be part of shaping the future of the rental market.
This is the complex issue with far-reaching consequences, and it deserves our attention and thoughtful discussion. So whether you're a renter, a landlord, or simply someone who cares about housing justice, we encourage you to learn more about the Renters' Rights Bill. Share your thoughts and be part of building a better future for housing in England.
Well said. Couldn't put it better myself.
That's all for our deep dive into the Renters' Rights Bill. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.